Hi everyone, and welcome to topic 10. And while the topic is nominally about the work in progress seminar, we've talked about that elsewhere. And so this week I wanted to focus on literature reviews. Literature reviews form a part of your research, obviously. They become a part of where you inform yourself about literature in your area of study, the literature being, I guess, scholarly work, practice, examples of practice, whether through creative products, best practice for those who are practitioners in professions, and gather that material together and position your research in the context of that. And it's something that you write as part of your research and part of your thesis and/or exegesis. But I'll get on to that form of the literature review right at the end. For the moment, I guess I just want to talk a little bit about what literature reviews are, and especially in the context of research methods, but also more broadly. So, literature reviews, I guess, first of all, situate your research within the work of a community of scholars. In fact, it's situating you in that community. And I guess for those who are researching practice, creative practice, as I say, professional practice, I guess it's also the work of a community of practitioners that you're situating your research within. So what you're doing in that is, I guess, informing your research through that work, as well as demonstrating your knowledge of the work of that community. This is obviously to your examiners, but it's to your readers more widely if your work gets published beyond your thesis. So there's a lot of detail this week in the study guide, reading 10.1. There's an enormous amount out there in YouTube land and other sources on literature reviews that you can also access and search for. I think a good thing also to do is to read theses and exegeses to get a feel for how a literature review looks, how it reads, and how it functions in a thesis, and especially in a thesis that's similar to yours in the discipline in which you're involved as well. That's really important. The context for these literature reviews is within the discipline that you're involved in, that you're engaged in, that your research is located within. And so it's important to know how literature reviews look and function within that discipline. In terms of the assignments in research methods, I guess the literature themes which we're asking you to outline in assignment 4 mark a transition between the author by author summaries of assignment 2 and the annotated bibliography, and assignment 5 in which you're asked to produce a literature review as part of your final research report. So that's I guess how the literature review will evolve through the assignments in research methods. So, in a bit more detail, what do literature reviews do? I guess they do a whole lot of things. We've already talked about some overview things in terms of situating your research within the research that others are doing. But clearly they help you refine your research question. It's through reading that we inform ourselves, that we come up with new ideas about our research, the focus of our research. It's not the only way that we refine our research question, but it's a key way of refining our research question. As we become better informed about a topic area, we understand a lot more about what's going on in that topic area, where the gaps in the literature might be, where we might add a contribution of some type. It demonstrates you've studied existing work in that field, and in particular, not just existing work, but sort of the state of knowledge in the particular subject area or area of practice. It can inform, and typically does inform, your rationale, that is, the value of your research, and why do this research. It links often to your methods as well, because you find out about how other people are approaching this particular problem, or a problem similar to yours, within your field. And so in that way you can be thinking about how your work is similar to or different from others' research in the field, and often that might say something about the rationale as well, that is, how your research might be different. The topic and keywords are obviously important because they're the things through which you identify the literature. So I guess in terms of a process, step one of a literature review is what you've already been doing, and that is identifying the literature through Google Scholar, through library catalogues, through databases at the library, those sorts of things. And typically in a research process, it should be done as early as possible, and you start with an annotated bibliography in the strict form of doing a research, of doing a literature review. So I guess being done as early as possible means that often a research proposal will include a literature review as part of a justification for why research is required. If you're doing an ethics application, if you're required to do one of those, part of justifying the research that you're doing, of putting people to the trouble of being involved as participants in your research, is saying that there's something new going to be done here that hasn't been done before, that makes this worthwhile. And while the literature review should be done as early as possible, I'd also say that it's an iterative process, because clearly as time goes on, the literature review can be refined. At first it might be quite wide in its scope, while your research problem remains maybe more open than it ends up. And as time goes on and the research question changes or the research problem changes, then the literature can be narrowed, because what you want to do is make your literature relevant to the research. In that way, the literature review is part of your research story, and you don't want to be taking your reader on a wide excursion that meanders through a whole lot of literature that isn't really relevant to the research and understanding your research story. So over time, the literature review becomes more and more relevant to the research at hand, and it often needs to be honed in that final editing process, when you sort of have a sense of the findings of your research and that trajectory and what's required to tell that story. The literature itself is generally secondary sources. I've already mentioned about it being limited by and specific to your research question and problem. It can also include creative work in the field, and issues or approaches that are informing that work, or current practice in the field as well. Typically you would try and include as much critical writing about that work rather than the work itself, but nevertheless, as part of the context for creative research, again, what community of practitioners are you drawing from, but also speaking to in your work? How does it fit within current practice? And as I've mentioned already, existing exegeses and theses are a great guide for seeing how to do this. There are a number of approaches to synthesizing a literature review. I guess this is now assuming that you've searched for literature, you've found literature, you've taken notes about that literature, and in an annotated bibliography or something similar, you've thought about the literature critically, because I guess part of the literature review is not just a survey, it's also an engagement with that literature in terms of your research. And the next stage, I guess, is to start synthesizing that literature into the review itself. And there are a number of approaches that can be taken to this. So I guess it's a little like you've got a whole list of ingredients in terms of the individual pieces of work that you've been reading, the literature itself. There's all those ingredients, and now you're going to create a meal out of it. Hopefully it's a light meal, it's an easy to consume meal, but nevertheless it's going to be synthesized. All those ingredients are going to be synthesized in some way, maybe into a number of courses. I won't take the metaphor any further than that. So the way that you might do that grouping together, that of making the menu, if you like, is varied. You might group together authors who say the same type of thing. And so you've sort of, the same thing might be a subheading, whatever that same thing is might be a subheading in your literature review. Literature reviews are often easier to consume with headings, because it gives your reader a guide to how you've organised the literature that you're reviewing. When I say literature now, I'm also talking about creative work, if that's relevant to your field. And then you might be comparing and contrasting those groups. You might be assessing methods that might be the purpose of the review itself, or one of the purposes of your review. There might be key issues or questions in your field, and so you're going to organise your literature around those key issues and questions. You might want to trace the development of an idea, of a concept, of a theory. And so that might be by, so that chronology may be also grouped into periods, schools, geographical, often scholars from a particular area, British cultural studies, just as an example, is different to American cultural studies and Australian cultural studies because of our different contexts. So that might be also a way. But in all of this, you're going to be covering relevant terminology and conceptual insights from the literature, things that you're gaining from the literature itself that are relevant to your research. The approach that you take is going to be dependent on your research problem, question, investigation. So there's no right or wrong way, but there might be a more appropriate way and a less appropriate way, depending on the question that you're attempting to answer. To continue this, you might also highlight areas of disagreement, exemplary studies, but in all of this also then talk about gaps in the research that's been done, or if it's not a gap, a way forward from this research that leads to your particular research. So I guess there's sort of the gap identification style of literature review, which is, I guess, a scientific approach. That idea of a stock of knowledge, and there's a gap in this stock, and you're going to fill that or add to that knowledge about a particular area. But there might also be in creative practice a leading out of practice, or that flows from what others are doing, that flows from your practice, and continues it on, either in terms of a continuum or maybe even a stepwise, shift in what you're doing. But in whatever you're doing, I guess the point of this is to be connecting your research with that which is already out there. So you conclude the literature review by summarising what the literature says, so that you can lead to your contribution, and clearly this means that the literature must relate to your questions, issues, problems. And so, as I said earlier, don't go too broad with the literature, keep it relevant to your research. And just to close, the form of the literature review can vary widely. Sometimes a literature review is a standalone chapter. And so in the classic thesis model, which we've also already discussed elsewhere, this standalone chapter often comes after the introduction because it situates the rest of what's to follow, both methodologically as well as the content. There are other forms of this though, and so the literature review can also, in cultural studies, humanities-based research, be distributed amongst the chapters. So if you were just to take an example, analysing the idea of the backyard through a number of lenses, so I'm talking about the suburban backyard, and you wanted to analyse the function of the suburban backyard through a number of lenses, then you might have a series of chapters which are windows onto the backyard. One looking maybe historically, one maybe looking through a feminist lens, one looking through a colonial or post-colonial lens. Class could be another one. You could keep imagining the sorts of windows and frames that you could take to examine the backyard. And so in each chapter that frames a different aspect of backyard practices as a cultural practice, you might have an integrated literature review, and it's just sort of distributed throughout all those different chapters. Again, I think this is where you can be creative with a literature review if that's a possibility in your particular discipline. And it's by reading other people's literature reviews that you'll find a form that works for you. There are, and I won't go on, I could keep talking about different possibilities, but it will just depend on the type of research you're doing. So again, this is a disciplinary specific thing that you can deal with and sort out as you start writing your thesis. So I think that's enough on literature reviews. There's a lot more out there. I'd encourage you to read the study guide and reading 10.1. It's a social scientific reading, but nevertheless gives you some good ideas about literature reviews. Not all of it will be relevant to everybody, but it's a good discussion of literature reviews. All research methods textbooks have something on literature reviews in them. So again, you can find something that's relevant to your particular discipline. And then there's even books that focus on literature reviews solely. So it's a big topic. It's just about finding enough information to get your head around what it is you need to do for your particular thesis. I think really it's in the writing that you're doing that you will start to figure out what form is appropriate for you and how the literature should be reviewed for your particular research. So all the best. We're getting through this this unit very quickly, and yes, we'll be back next week with something else. Okay, bye bye.